hey man, there's parallel universes to our own. Cool? Maybe, maybe not. How do I know? I can't test it. Now, on the other hand, wave cyclone theory we can test. Well, a cold front's moving through. We think it's going to provide the upper level divergence to drop the surface pressure, lifting air so that it will expand and thus adiabatically cool, and it down to dew point and below for several thousand feet. We expect cloud production to produce the conditions required for natural cloud seeding by way of the Bergeron process. Hence, we're expecting an interprecip somewhere in the western United States. Okay, the next day. Okay, what happens? Well, 2 days later. Well, what do you know? Torrance got nailed. Well, that's cool. Might not have happened. It's kind of like evolution theory. If you go out there and say something like, I bet you know, can you design a test to say something about the geologic time scale relative to when humans were around versus, say, dinosaurs? All you got to do to go out and destroy the geologic time scale, at least to cause re-alteration, go find a human fossil in Mesozoic age sediments. Heck, go find a human fossil in Paleozoic sediments. You know, march on in with a bulldozer into Grand Canyon into its Paleozoic rock unit and try to find a human fossil. Go for it. Try it. Do it. If you find it, you'll destroy the geologic time scale. So potentially, it's easy to devise a test that can potentially what? Destroy the geologic time scale, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the situation is that our ability to observe, for instance, you want to dig out fossils, there's nothing better in San Diego than what? A massive home subdivision. Bring in bulldozers and rip apart the ground, and anymore by state law, it's required that who has to follow? Oh, the paleontologists, because any type of fossils you pull out have to be cataloged, etc. So if you put in something like the new section of the 125 right past the campus here in the last 10 years, the proto-oreodont fossils and all that kind of stuff that got pulled out as we constructed that project, of course, had to be cataloged, and we got some of them on display around the campus somewhere. But you build bulldozers, you invent bulldozers, your ability to observe the fossil record, of course, greatly improves. It's kind of like telescopes. You build a telescope, all of a sudden your ability to observe reality does what? Changes, and you can bring in new data. What if you build a microscope? Oh my gosh, that radically changes your ability to observe. So we'll eventually do what with something like sickness? Well, we'll do this radical change that occurs, you know, by the mid-1800s over there in Soho of London. You had another cholera outbreak. So people were doing what? They were whipping themselves because apparently their sin, they thought, was causing them the disease, and therefore they were trying to repent of this sin. And then eventually John Smith, I think his name was, famously said, oh, I got a better idea. Why don't you stop drinking your piss water? And so since they were expelling that material right next to the well that they were pulling their drinking water out of, he just kind of tapped the well, and what happened to the cholera epidemic? It was over. Because this new theory, germ theory, had come online, and we now force doctors to do what at the operation table? And they'll be decertified and kicked out of the profession if they don't. And they'll wear a mask. Because we've got this new theory that came along that said, disease ain't caused by what you did morally, it's caused by germs. Oh, and we can even see over in the biology department bacteria, blah, 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 anymore. The ability to observe is a function of our technology. If you build a microscope, or how about what we're doing now, if you build a particle accelerator, so you can take stuff, the smallest stuff we know of, accelerate it together in these tracks that are miles and miles long, and slam them together and break them into smaller and smaller pieces to see how small we can make matter. We still haven't found an end to it as we observe reality at those types of scales, or at the grander and grander scales, and things like the Hubble telescope. This affords us the ability to make new observations. So what is it that we need to say about any particular scientific theory? Realize, since scientific theory is always based on observation, and since our ability to observe is tied to our technology, and since technology, of course, changes potentially over time, then all scientific theories are there for always provisional. our scientific theories are our best explanations given what? The current data. Now, of course, if you bring in new data, then you're going to probably expect, oh, golly, maybe, what do you know? Maybe it's new data that we have never considered. For instance, if you make a hypothesis, you hypothesize that all cats are Siamese cats. And you leave this class to go over to weight training class, and you see a Siamese cat going into weightlifting as well. Oh, what do you know? What are you? That's incredible. But anyway, did that prove that all cats are Siamese cats? No, it's just evidence in support of your hypothesis. But it certainly doesn't prove that all cats are Siamese cats. What happens by the time you get home tonight? You see a tomcat sitting on the porch when you get home. Ah, right then that tells you what? Well, my hypothesis has been rejected. I've disproved the supposition that all cats are Siamese cats. That's what science is good at, because science is based on what you can know. Since it's based on what you can observe, then science seeks to do what? Science seeks to disprove. Science seeks to tear down explanations, because that's what it can do. Science can't prove anything, but it sure can what? It sure can disprove things. Now that's basic reality about science seems to be lost on the American public, but that's, of course, how science operates. Science does what? It goes out there to tear things apart. That's the rigor of the scientific process. That being the case, there's nothing divine, there's nothing dogmatic ultimately about scientific theory. If you bring in new data that destroys your old model, then what do you do with the old model? You say, that model's out of here. And do what? Generate a new model that better fits the data. So the last thing we can say is scientific theories are therefore, or let's put it in broader terms, the scientific process therefore allows new observations to enlighten it. Or put another way, the scientific process therefore accepts as a vital part of the process the role of modification. It's not valid in the scientific world to say, well, that's how we've always been doing it. No, the only thing that's valid is what the observations say. So, rather famously, it seems to be lost, by the way, on the American public of today. As you know, you'll find newspaper articles, or somebody like Fox News will come on and they'll say, oh yeah, those frickin' physical anthropologists over there in the East African Rib Zone, they found a new hominid fossil, and the news will say, causing anthropologists to rewrite their explanations of human evolution, as if those idiots just can't get their story straight. Okay, well, what they fail to realize is the strength of the scientific process is that modification is allowed. If you get new data, in fact, modification of your model is required. So that all being the case, realize that modification is not the weakness of the scientific process. Modification is the strength of the scientific process that makes it different than most other pursuits. Most famously, you probably know the story, well, in high school, a lot of you at least probably know the story of Newton in the 1680s. Comes up with his Principia that sets forth his laws of motion in general, including that law that explains why the planets move around the sun in elliptical orbit, and in fact, it explains all motion. Here on Earth, downward toward Earth, blah, 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 blah. Why is it that when the apple is cut off the tree, it goes down? Oh, due to what, says Newton? Due to some force. You can call it the universal law of gravitation. And if you take his universal law of gravitation, along with his laws of motion, second law of motion, plug them into each other for the planets, then you can predict where the planets are going to be 10, 20, 30, 50, 100 years ago as they move around sun and are viewed from Earth. A very powerful type thing to do back in superstitious Europe of the 16, 17, 1800s and the like. But as we move through the 17, 1800s, what happens to technology? Well, we invent things like telescopes. And if you start doing that, you get better and better data on where the planets are, what do we start to find happens to that planet closest to Sun? We call that Mercury. Where does Mercury actually end up relative to what Newtonian mechanics predicts? Well, it doesn't end up in the same place that the laws of motion from Newton predict.